Hello, Com 230. We are going to talk a little bit today about Chapter 8, Decision-Making and Problem-Solving in Groups. If you're with me on the book, it's page 151 if you'd like to follow along. The first thing that we're looking at doing, of course, is trying to determine what is the difference between decision-making and problem-solving. Now, think about this. Remember, as I talked about in a previous class, some of my original research was in the small group decision making as it relates to jury deliberation. Now think about this. A decision is a very narrow question where one needs to come up with a specific answer to a specific question. So it's much narrow. Problem-solving groups probably have a vast number of decisions that they have to come to in order to solve any particular problem. All right, so if we think about that in this terms, what is the first decision a judge will often tell a jury about wanting to make? Is what's your first decision you need to let us know the answer to? Well, when a jury finally is released from court, the first day at any rate, or after a trial has commenced, they are to go back to the jury deliberation room, however that is set up. And oftentimes, the problem is determining within a reasonable doubt the outcome decision of the trial based on the opening arguments, the presentation of evidence, and the closing statements. But the first decision in that whole long list of decisions that will come from that problem to solve is going to be who will be the jury foreman. The judge will often tell them your first task is to go out and select a foreman. So if they're going to go out and select a foreman, research tells us that when they get into the deliberation room, everyone sits around a table. The person who will wind up being the foreman a good 90+% of the time is going to be either the first person or the second person who speaks. Now, there is a small percentage of time where this does not actually play out this way, but whoever winds up picking up the instruction sheet, or if there are multiple instruction sheets to the jury, all of them pick it up, but then whoever winds up picking it up and speaking first, or whoever, if they all have it, the first one to speak, will say one of two things. They will either say, well, I guess the first thing we have to do is pick a foreman for this jury, and then they'll go off one of two ways here. I'll do it if nobody else cares. Because most people don't know who that person is, and because most people don't know who any other of these people are in this room, theoretically, because a jury is often of your peers from the community in which the crime occurred, but rarely are they actually knowing of each other, unless it's a very small town. And so, if they don't know each other, they don't know if it's worth arguing about what this person's leadership credentials might be, on and on and on. What's the credibility of it there? And so, I'll do it if nobody else cares. Usually we'll get everyone else to go, okay. The alternative, when I said one of two things, well, the first thing I guess we have to do is pick a jury, someone will say. Does anybody here want to do it? Typically, the next person who speaks will wind up with it for the exact same reasons. So the next person who speaks will be somebody else other than that speaker, and that person will say, well, I'll do it if nobody cares. And for the same reasons, people will go ahead and ignore, not challenge that per se, and they'll go right after it. The alternative, of course, is that same person who says, does anyone want to do it? And whether or not they're waiting for someone to respond or just pretending to wait for somebody to respond, they, of course, will jump in and say, well, and does anybody want to do it? Because if nobody else wants to do it, I'd be happy to do it if nobody cares. And so occasionally you'll have somebody who will challenge that, but not often. So the first or second person who speaks is typically going to be the foreman, hence the first decision is taken care of, and the first decision is done. And that can be a quick decision, but it is a group decision nonetheless, as everyone kind of mumbles their assent, going, yeah, okay, all right, whatever. And so when we're talking about, and that's the other thing we're talking about here is, so the difference between a group decision-making and problem-solving. Problem-solving, the problem may have many decisions, so it's a greater scope. Decision-making is much narrower, and it might be individual and very specific questions. What color car do you want to buy when you go buy your next car? Well, it might be that the color doesn't matter because you're looking for something else. Or it might be, I specifically want a gray, blue, green, orange car, whatever it might be. And so you're making that decision. Well, the question is it a group decision or is it an individual decision? And in that case, it might be individual, but the decision has been made. All right. So decision-making versus problem-solving is important to note. As we start going through this book, you'll notice that they even talk a little bit about a jury there. It's a short-lived work group, in essence. A judging panel, kind of looking over, whether we're judging speeches or a baking contest. Might be a panel of people doing as well. So we have to look at small groups. They can be short-lived, they can be longer-lived, or a lifetime, depending upon how we compose and think about it. For example, a family reunion committee that is responsible for a very large extended family, getting them together occasionally, periodically, however often, every year, every 5 years, every 10 years, whatever it might be. That particular group of people, however, that small group that's planning it, whether you want to call it a committee or not, sometimes we're a little bit hesitant to do that when it's, like our family. But there's oftentimes people who kind of represent certain factions of the family, depending upon what parts of the country they may be in, or countries they may reside, or the like. So, but we start thinking about that in terms of groups and decisions. So, page 154, we start going into problem solving in small groups already. And one of the things that we want to do is recognize that there are certainly very serious differences between them. I want you to flip over to page 155, and you can see in that small blue chart there sort of the differences between decision-making groups and problem-solving groups. So, again, this should be already a quick review of what we've just covered. So, decision-making groups have a limited decision-making charge, so limited number of questions to really get into. Problem-solving groups, complex problem-solving task. In other words, it's some major task that's going to be composed of probably multiple decisions. Decision-making groups often receive no special training per se, especially if it's really kind of decisions that are focus group based, preferences, favorites, least favorites kinds of things, choices of what are we serving at the banquet concept. And then problem-solving groups might often be tasked with specialized training, especially if it's a economic problem, a medical problem, like we're facing right now in terms of this COVID-19 issue and things of this nature. What are the credentials and the training of the task forces that are working on the front lines, or even the bigger scope picture on how to rectify the situation that we're facing and deciding how we're all going to move forward as a society. Decision-making groups use a narrower skill set, and problem-solving groups need creative problem-solving skills. So again, we're narrowing our choices in what we're doing, often have no authority or responsibility after making and announcing a decision. Decision-making groups, here's the decision. Whereas problem-solving groups are often now tasks for actually implementing the decisions and actually seeing that they work. And you can see, you can start to see the difference a little bit more evolved as we go through. Okay, you can see on page 156, the 10 elements of low-quality small group decisions. How do we know that some of the decisions that we're seeing are just poor? How do we know that they're just poor decisions? Well, oftentimes, and you can see, I'm just going to read them down here for you because I think they are important to pay attention to. Number one, too much evidence or information. Information overload. We're almost paralyzed by having too much that it's just, at that point, it's like we have no idea which way to run because we're calculating far too many variables in it. But the alternative can also be true too. Look at number two, insufficient evidence or information, and it's an information underload, meaning I don't have enough information to truly make a good quality decision, so I wind up making a decision that may not be great for everything we're trying to do. Three, insufficient deliberation time. You got to make a decision in the next 5 minutes on something that's globally impacting. Yeah, that doesn't work too easy, does it? Because we can never actually get all the information or process all the information as a result. Influence from outside parties. This is basically people who have nothing to do with the stakes in the game. You know, I don't have you've heard the idea that I don't have a stake in this. I'm not a stakeholder. This decision doesn't affect me, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you how to do make your decision anyway. You know, unless you're a trusted advisor, what are you doing? You know, that kind of a thing. Number five, hidden agendas. People who have their own agendas that with maybe guiding you on your particular decision as a group, they're also able to advance their agenda, not really caring what your purpose and quality of your decision was. 6, poor communication. 7, poor or faulty reasoning. 8, too much conflict. You know, if the group is just conflicting too much, arguing, quarreling, fighting, whatever, however we define this, you're not going to make a good quality decision, because a lot of times people are going to make a decision in exasperation and just throw up their hands and be done with it. Too little conflict, meaning everybody is group thinking. They're just, somebody said something, they're all just going along with it. And you got to remember, you were put on this group to help make this decision because your opinion was valued, and you do a disservice just to go along with it, because then when the decision turns out to be a poor one, it's easier enough to claim you had nothing to do with it when in fact you agreed with it, whether or not you want to admit that at that point. And then finally, poor decision-making processes. You just didn't have a good process in place to put that all together. Now, as we go through the next couple of pages, it describes this a little bit more, and I think it's important for you to actually go through that so that you fully understand it. Page 163, you're going to see the 10 elements of high-quality decision-making. So number one, you've got the right people. The right people in the room, and they know why they're there. They know what the decision is, and they know how to go about finding it. Number two, adequate time to make that decision, go through the process. Number three, we can set aside our preconceptions, our biases, to actually take in information that's presented to us without already judging it or prejudging it. And then number four, open, frank discussion. You allow yourselves as a group to actually have a full-fledged discussion about what's going on. Number five, all the necessary information and evidence is made available. Notice the key term here, necessary, meaning not too much, not too little, but the necessary information that I need in order to really kind of examine this context to make a decision as a group. We have it available to us. Number six, members share their analysis and evaluation of that information. 7, members support the assertions with adequate evidence and sound reasoning. Something that in some cases in today's day and age, adequate evidence and sound reasoning seems to be a lost art and skill. Let's get back to it. If you can't tell me with good evidence why you believe something, then what are you telling me for in the first place? Because this isn't a time for just straight opinions or gut feelings when actual evidence is required. Number 8, all options and alternatives are explored. So even if we put them all on the board, let's go through this and kind of talk about what happens if. How do we implement this if? Number 9, conflict is managed appropriately. Now, conflict can be managed in a healthy way, and it can be managed in a very unhealthy way. And if conflict is managed in a healthy way, then we are able to learn, grow, and actually kind of work through issues to be better on the other side of conflict. And then number 10, members aim for a consensus decision. Notice I am not saying a democratic decision of we're just going to have a vote and 1 over half wins, or the majority wins. That might work, but the consensus is often of how can we make everybody happy with the decision? Is it possible? It might break down to something else, but we aim for trying to make sure that all of our goals for the entire group are put together. Then you will find, as we start moving through the next couple of pages, that you will see explanations a little bit more directly on those bits of information that we're looking for. When we're looking, and I want to point out on page 166 about sharing their analysis and evaluation of information and backing it up with credible information and evidence. The 5 criteria for evaluating information and evidence is listed right here: credibility, currency, relevance, representativeness, and sufficiency. Highly important to think about in terms of how do I suggest to anyone else in the group that the evidence I am giving you is credible, it's good. Well, that's how I'm going to do it. Go through those 5. Okay, so we're going to continue on. On page 169, we look at a really good section there on how do I go about an agenda, but it's a process. What is the 6-step process for doing good problem solving? So number 1, identify and define the problem. It's amazing to me how many groups get together and tell me how they're going to solve the problem without having a full understanding of what the problem actually is. Number 2, analyze that problem. Take it apart. What are all the components and what are all the moving parts? What are all the pieces that we really have to address? And then, and then I love doing whiteboard work, for example. Let's go ahead and start brainstorming and putting everyone out there with what are the ways we can actually come up with solutions. Put everything on the board, as crazy as it may sound, because then we can go through to the next step, number 4, decide on a criteria for judging the solutions. So all the stuff we have brainstormed and we put up on a list somewhere, let's come up with a criteria for determining whether or not any of those solutions are viable and good. And then once we've done that, number 5, evaluate each of these along that same criteria. Select the solutions that are going to be implemented, and of course then number 6, implement those solutions. And if you will think about those terms, in fact, at one time I had a very similar list like this that I had written down in my day planner when I carried a day planner around with me all the time, because that way when people came to me and said, we have a problem, I would open this up and say, let's go through the steps. It's great. It's a good way of thinking about it. So that is described more thoroughly as you go through the next few pages as well. In fact, it's described very, very thoroughly. And that brings us essentially to the end of this chapter. So as we're looking at this, chapter 9, we're going to get into critical thinking and argumentation in groups. So we're getting real close to wrapping up the text specifically. A couple more chapters here. But I want you to look over that quiz. I'm going to put up a discussion question to kind of follow along with this. And then we are going to have a talk about the small group projects and what form they will take here before we're all said and done. But as far as all this goes, let's just keep at it as much as we can. Be well, and let me know if you have any other questions. Thanks.